Support for This Day in Esoteric Political History comes from Odoo. What is Odoo? Well, Odoo is an all-in-one management software with apps for every business need. Odoo has apps for CRM, accounting, sales, HR, inventory, manufacturing, and everything in between. And they're all in one easy-to-use software. And the best part about Odoo? All Odoo apps are integrated, helping you get things done faster and more efficiently. So, when you think about business, think Odoo. To learn more, visit odoo.com/thisday. That's odoo.com/thisday. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, and actually it is February 11th, 1990, I want to make clear because it's a big momentous date. So we're talking about February 11th, 1990. Nelson Mandela is released from prison 27 years after he was first jailed for his efforts to fight against South African apartheid. We'll get into the conditions under which he suffered while in prison and how the government tried to suppress any information about him from coming out, which of course famously did not work. Mandela was a global cause celeb, the symbol of the oppression in South Africa and the fight for freedom. Within hours of his release, he was on stage addressing thousands. His first words in public after 27 years were, "Comrades and fellow South Africans, I greet you all in the name of peace, democracy, and freedom." So let's talk about the moment that Mandela is released and the pressure campaign that led to it. Here, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
Let's start in one of the silliest places, but one of the things that I think we should mention,
Awesome.
and I think it's come up on this show a couple times before, but do you know about the so-called Mandela effect?
Mandela effect?
Oh, actually, I've heard that phrase a million times,
Okay,
but I could
so
not tell you off my head.
The
What-
Mandela
No.
effect is a psychological phenomenon in which people sort of en masse invent details about a story. And it's not like, oh, I misheard this thing and I personally have this thing, but it's this kind of effect where it's like you sort of realize that everyone has a similar and very precise and so often very sort of esoteric, misremembering. So a classic one, it's called the Mandela effect, so it's named after this. But, another classic one is everyone thinks that it's Berenstein Bears, but it's actually Bernstein Bears, or maybe it's the reverse. But people kind of put an extra letter into the name of that book. And there's something about the Fruit of the Loom logo, which everyone, when you ask people to draw the Fruit of the Loom logo, they always draw a cornucopia, but there's actually not a cornucopia in it. And so it's we've collectively invented it. So the Mandela effect itself is supposedly this idea that a ton of people have that Mandela died in prison. And apparently people have this idea, which that's my reaction too. So I knew about the Mandela effect. I kind of knew that it was named about something about Mandela, but I never actually kind of stopped and said, wait a minute, what is the actual sort of false
How could
notion
he
that
died in prison?
And it's absurd. How can people think they died in prison? Let's see, here's the thing that I like to say. It's I think Mandela affected the Mandela effect in that I had this misconstrued notion of what the Mandela effect actually was. I was like, there's no way it could be something as obviously wrong as Mandela died in prison. He famously got released from prison, which is what we're talking about here. But anyway, so I've always...
That's crazy.
I enjoy the Mandela effect as a thing, but I think that the heart of it, the thing it's named after, is patently absurd, and I don't know why people think that Mandela.
But Fruit of the Loom in that cornucopia, I buy that.
I know.
Yeah. I have a clear picture in my mind. So this is a debunking episode.
I don't know. I've twisted myself into knots here, but delusional knots here. But obviously, Mandela did not die in prison.
Nope.
He was famously released, which is what we're talking about here. But let's talk about his time in prison. 27 years. I suppose we should just start with the conditions under which he suffered. I mean, he enters prison. He's convicted of treason by the apartheid government, and he is famously at Robben Island Prison. Want to talk a little bit about his conditions there and what life is like while Mandela is imprisoned?
Yeah. I mean, the conditions in South Africa as a whole are oppressive. I mean, when you think about apartheid, a lot of people make the comparison to the United States and Jim Crow segregation. And it's a violent, oppressive system in which there is extreme segregation, but also extreme violence as well. People were thrown into prison and given life sentences for petty crimes, many times often for no crimes being committed. And Nelson Mandela is accused of treason. And when he's sent to prison, he's about 45 or 46 years old, so not old at all. Sent to Robben Island. Robben Island was known as one of the most notorious prisons that you could sort of ever be housed in. The labor that you are doing while you are there is absurd. So you might be there just busting up rocks and crunching rocks into smaller rocks. It was never meant to sort of give you dignity while you were in prison. You were given horrible food, very little to none at all medical care. There are a lot of physical ailments that Nelson Mandela suffered throughout the decades being in prison there, nearly 3 decades being in prison there. And so it is a harsh condition. Not only that, but you're not given a lot of outside contact. So you might receive a letter once every 6 months. You might have a visitor once a year for 30 minutes once a year. And so it's meant to not just harm you physically, but even psychologically.
Yeah.
Yeah. And at Robben Island, I mean, now Nelson Mandela's prison has become a place people go and visit. Barack Obama very famously goes and visits while he's president. Yet at the time, you don't have pictures coming out of Nelson Mandela in these conditions. It's a tiny cell that he's in. There's no bedding. There's no plumbing. It is dank and scarce and empty. There are these things, though, because he is you called him a global cause célèbre, and that's exactly right. And that was true even when he was in prison. I don't know if it was at Robben Island or one of the later places, but he is organizing rugby matches, and he is his visitors are world leaders who are coming to meet with him because he has become this touchstone for the anti-apartheid movement and for a vision of freedom, and becomes a kind of heroic figure that people are reaching out to, even despite the South African government's attempts to keep him hidden away and out of the limelight.
So it's 18 years from when he's first jailed in 1964 that he's on Robben Island, and there is really lockdown on information. Then he moves to house arrest, which I think begins the slow and inevitable process of not just his release, but the sort of dismantling of apartheid. But it's during house arrest that people finally see photos of him again, and world leaders kind of start to visit. But, I'm curious, in retrospect, this looks like one of those classic stories of the cover-up or the attempt to suppress was the thing that made him even more of a cause célèbre. That said, totalitarian regimes memory hole people all the time. And sometimes they do put people in prisons or gulags or whatever, and they just disappear from limelight. But clearly that did not work here. And, I'm sure there are millions of books and documentaries about why that is. But maybe it's a chance to talk a little bit about, we've touched on it a little bit. I'm endlessly fascinated by the anti-apartheid movement throughout the globe, in part because I think it is so tied up in sort of cultural politics, which is sort of my big area of interest. But maybe this is a chance to talk about why we think Mandela in particular, despite having zero contact with the outside world, is still nevertheless this hero. Or maybe it's not despite, maybe it's because of that exact thing.
I mean, shout out to Winnie Mandela. His wife was holding down the fort for all those years and really keeping his name, his memory, and his politics alive. And not just Winnie Mandela, but all of those who sort of allied and partnered with Mandela ensured that he was not forgotten and that people continued to push and fight to get his name out in the public so that no one would forget about what he was trying to accomplish and what everyone was trying to accomplish in terms of ending apartheid.
It was also a consequence of the brutal nature of apartheid. I mean, Kellie mentioned earlier that about this comparison with segregation, and that was certainly true, but it was also the mass displacement of people. Black people were moved out of certain areas and given their own regions to live in. You had to have a pass in order to come into Johannesburg and other places to work. It was a cruel and brutal and just such a stark system. And as we'll probably talk about, South Africa was a U.S. ally. And so in addition to the movements that are happening around around Africa and in Europe and other places, in the United States, Black Americans are pointing to this and saying, these are the people who we're allied with. Like, there's an opportunity here to put pressure on not just the American government, which was a little hit and miss, but on U.S. corporations to say to places like Coca-Cola, is this what you stand for? You support apartheid in South Africa? And that pressure campaign, which included boycotts and protests, not only
economic sanctions
and music
that's the shape of this anti-apartheid movement. That's a global movement.
Yeah.
So before we started taping, Nikki, you said we should do an episode at some point about the pro-apartheid movement in this country. Which, do you want to say a few words about that? But we should find, I mean, it'd be really fascinating to find a proper episode to get into that. I don't think people realize.
We should do a proper episode on this, but in the 1970s and 1980s, on the right in the United States, there is a dedicated pro-apartheid movement that is both making overtly racist arguments about, like, Black people in South Africa are not ready for self-government. That's running in the pages of National Review, but also, like, attacks on anti-apartheid protests, in part because South Africa was a Cold War ally and the right supported them on that front. They also supported them on the white rule front. But, you know, President Reagan is going to remain a staunch ally of South Africa. And ultimately, it's going to be Congress that pushes this through because of both the Cold War allyship. It's ultimately Congress that pushes through the economic sanctions, which Reagan does not want. But I think that Cold War angle is really important because when is Nelson Mandela getting out of prison? In the early 1990s, 3 or 4 months after the Berlin Wall comes down. Like, that also feels important to this part of the story.
Absolutely. And, you know, I think worth noting, to bring it back to this moment we're discussing here, when Mandela gets out, I read that quote. The first word he says is comrades. He says comrades and fellow South Africans. And, you know, I think like a lot of Black liberation leaders we've talked about here, he was, I think, sympathetic to other forms of political thought and also accused during the height of the Cold War of being a commie. So there's a little interesting sort of picture of the anti-apartheid, pro-apartheid movements throughout the world. Let's talk about sort of the actual release. Let me just point out an obvious thing, which is I think to so many people, it was an incredible moment of joy. I also think there was just a real shock at his age. And, you know, I mean, not to state the obvious, 27 years is a long time in prison, but I just remember.
He's 72.
You know, people were just seeing him and seeing an aged Mandela still vital and fighting, and obviously goes on to, you know, have a hugely consequential chapter in his life. But seeing his age, I think, was a real gut punch for a lot of people in that very sense of it was just showed the passage of time and the sort of struggle that was lost and the sort of, you know, really just sort of put it right out there in the open for people at a real visceral level. Hosted by Lindsey Graham, Wondery's podcast American History Tellers takes you to the events, times, and people that shaped America and Americans. In the latest series, American History Tellers explores the Underground Railroad, a covert network of secret routes and safe houses operated by men and women committed to helping enslaved people escape bondage in the South. Follow American History Tellers on the Wondery app or wherever you get your podcasts.
I empathize a lot with Mandela in the sense that when he has these sort of early meetings with F.W. de Klerk about his release, you know, Mandela is hesitant and sort of saying like, yes, I want to get out of prison as soon as possible, but can I have a little bit of time to talk to my family, to talk to my team, to adjust to this reality? Because taking someone out of prison and then immediately throwing them into the limelight with no period of adjustments. I mean, a lot has changed in 27 years. A lot of his family dynamics have absolutely changed. And he doesn't really have a moment to sort of take a beat before he is thrust into this political limelight, and it's a matter of years after that where he becomes president of South Africa. So it's just an incredible warp speed journey that he has from the moment he's released.
Yeah, we should say F.W. de Klerk was the new president of South Africa, and he had started the process as the Cold War was coming to an end of dismantling apartheid, let's say very, very, very slowly and with a considerable amount of violence over the next several years. But that's why Mandela is getting out of prison at this moment. It is part of the winding down of apartheid, which, again, takes a long time. And then, as Kellie mentioned, in 94, Mandela is going to become the first president of a united and free South Africa, which is, again, like, he's 75 at that point? Like, it is a remarkable second or third chapter of his life, because he's also going to live until 2013. So he lives to quite an old age.
Yeah.
I remember not just his release, but in 1994, they showed the elections in South Africa. For the first time, Black South Africans are able to vote because apartheid banned all Black people from voting. And the lines go for miles, just like there's those iconic photographs of people lined up to vote for Mandela. And it's such a powerful image.
Yeah. Some other tidbits to throw in. Well, one, the first thing he does when he's released is he has a glass of whiskey with de Klerk. He shares a glass of whiskey. I can only imagine what kind of polite small talk they make there. He gets released. You're right, Kellie, this whirlwind. I mean, he gives speeches. He goes and visits with Winnie. He goes and visits with Desmond Tutu, who is obviously the big other figure in the ANC, and they often end up disagreeing over the subsequent years. And then we've done an episode of this, but he almost immediately comes to the United States. That summer is when Mandela does his tour of the United States. He goes to Boston. We did an episode about Mandela visiting Boston and sort of uniting the liberation struggles.
He meets Rosa Parks.
Exactly. So it is whirlwind. And then 93 he gets the Nobel Peace Prize. 94 he gets elected. It is worth pointing out that this stretch, these few years after Mandela is released, are actually some of the most tumultuous and fraught years in South African history. There's almost more political violence in that stretch. I think 10,000 people die in political squabbles, and it is the messy, horrific, tragic sort of unwinding of this apartheid state. So it's not like, for I think a lot of people in the world, Mandela is released and all of a sudden, liberation is here.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people wanted Mandela to be sort of like an MLK, to push nothing but, nonviolence. And in fact, President Bush meets with Mandela and actually requests like, hey, can you, sort of take on this MLK ideology? And it's interesting that Mandela's like, no, I'm not gonna renounce the use of violence to end white domination. Nope, won't do it.
Yeah, I think that idea, Jody, that you mentioned of liberation is a messy and often deadly process. And I think we do have this kind of very cleaned up, shiny image of what liberation looks like, right? Just pure joy, and then everybody gets to move on in freedom. And we also, to Kellie's point, have this very cleaned up vision of what social change looks like, right? That nonviolence is the best way to do things, and that violence delegitimizes a liberation movement. But I mean, Mandela was in prison because he was leading a paramilitary movement against the South African government. Which was using violence against Black people.
Listen, shameless
Do you have thoughts on this, Kellie?
Shameless plug, but my next book, We Refuse, covers all of this. Like the introduction, I'm talking about Desmond Tutu and South African apartheid, and just like the mantra of We Refuse is like, listen, no, we're not going down peacefully.
Okay, one last little thing, which is both, it's inevitable that when you talk about sort of the politics of the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, there's going to be a Joe Biden misremembering something story. But it is also nicely resonant to the Mandela effect, right? Joe Biden has his own Mandela, his own personal Mandela effect, that he has been caught making up stories about Nelson Mandela. And so he claimed, it's a whole thing. There's a whole fact-checking article about it. But he's several times told a story about how basically, on the day that Mandela was released, he was in Soweto and he was trying to go to Robben Island and see Mandela. All of those facts were wrong. But, he said that he'd been arrested trying to kind of get to Mandela or be part of the sort of joy of him, And like a lot of Biden stories, right? Like all the underlying context is probably true. Like, he was very anti-apartheid. He did visit South Africa a number of times. He did build a relationship with Mandela. But, you know, the very specifics, like, they talk to people and they're like, Joe Biden was in South Africa in like 77, not in the moment that Mandela was released.
Seems about right.
Soweto is like hundreds of miles away from Robben Island. Like, it wouldn't make sense that you're like crashing down a gate in Soweto.
I think we know if he got arrested too.
Yes.
I mean, that feels like that might make the news.
I shared a cell with Mandela.
But, exactly. But that is Joe Biden's personal Mandela effect. And so there you go. All right. Well, we will leave it there. Really fascinating. And I think, listeners, you can tell all three of us are really, really interested in the kind of apartheid and anti-apartheid and pro-apartheid movement. So I think we should pick at that a little bit more throughout the year. All right. As we wrap up, as we often do, let's do some also on this days. There's a lot of interesting stuff here, but we'll touch on 4 of them. So other things that happened, February 13th.
In 1935, a jury in Flemington, New Jersey found Bruno Richard Hauptmann guilty of first-degree murder in the slaying of Charles A. Lindbergh Jr., a.k.a. the Lindbergh baby, who was the 20-month-old son of Charles and Anne Lindbergh. Hauptmann, in keeping with our theme this week, was later executed.
Yeah. The Lindbergh baby thing, obviously, like one of the first huge, not one of the first, but a huge early conspiracy theory that he actually hadn't died, and there was questions of his identity. And put this on the list of American history as refracted through The Simpsons and me learning about it. But there's that amazing moment where Grandpa Simpson claims to be the Lindbergh baby.
And in 1980, the 13th Winter Olympics opened in Lake Placid, New York.
I was there a few years ago, and like basically the entire infrastructure of that Winter Olympics is still there. There were still people doing like ski jumps. It's really cool.
Yeah, I mean, I did an episode of Good Sport about kind of like the aftermath of the Olympics and hosting the Olympics. We've talked a little bit about it on this show, and I think Lake Placid is both kind of, you could see both there. You could see like a small town bent over backwards, built all this stuff, and then it's just lying there decaying. That said, you could argue that all the facilities that got built there sort of accelerated at least the sort of U.S. Winter Olympics program. But anyway, what were you doing in Lake Placid?
I was giving a talk there when one of my books came out. It was awesome. It's a gorgeous place.
Yeah. This day, February 13th, 1991, during Operation Desert Storm, our first invasion of Iraq, Allied warplanes destroy an underground shelter in Baghdad that had been identified as a military command center, but Iraqi officials said that 500 civilians were killed. It is the second Iraq war that often sort of people understand as having a huge amount of civilian death, and we've weirdly thought of the first Iraq war as like clinical and full of targeted attacks, you know, and I think it's important to remember that there were many, many civilian deaths for that generation as well.
Yeah, and the infrastructure that was destroyed led to hundreds of thousands of deaths in the years that followed. And in 2016, on this day, break out your calendars, Justice Antonin Scalia, the influential conservative and provocative member of the U.S. Supreme Court, was found dead at a private residence in the Big Bend area of West Texas. Speaking of conspiracy theories, the pillow on top of Scalia's face.
Oh, yeah.
Was it a My Pillow?
I mean, look, I'm not saying anything because defamation suits are popular in that region of the pillow industry.
I didn't even realize that was one.
Just saying.
Oh, man.
And of course, you know, Congress and Senate snap into action,
immediately name his replacement. Vote within a month, I think.
Yeah, I believe so. Yeah, we'll see.
We'll work on that alternate history
we'll get
later.
Jacob to check on it. That's our Scalia Mandela effect right there. All right. Well, that brings to the end of the episode. Thanks, as always, Nicole Hemmer. Thanks to you.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson. Thanks to you.
My pleasure.
They leave the Victor Verster prison. Officials, marshals of the National Reception Committee trying to get the people, and a salute from Mr. Nelson Mandela, his wife Winnie, greeting the people outside the fences of the Victor Verster prison. That is the man who the world has been waiting to see. His first public appearance in nearly 3 decades.
Radiotopia.